It is the 26th of August, 1346. In the field south of Calais, an outnumbered English army, commanded by the King of England, Edward III, confronts the forces of the French king, Philip VI. As the fighting rages, the right of the English line is assaulted with fury by the Count of Alençon, causing the English ranks to buckle under the pressure. The second in command of the English right, the Earl of Warwick, sends a message to King Edward begging for assistance, telling him that his son, the 16-year-old Edward, Prince of Wales, is in mortal danger. But the English king decides his son must fight on and prove his valor, stating that the prince must win his spurs. And soon, after being thrown to the ground in the crush and rescued by his standard-bearer, the young Edward rallies his men and beats back the advancing French, until by dusk, the field belongs to the English, and the legend of the Black Prince is born. Before we begin, a quick word from our sponsor, Surfshark. In the modern age, staying safe and protected online has never been so important. This is where Surfshark VPN comes in, as when you go online, your location as well as all the data you send and receive is open to attack, whereas Surfshark hides or encrypts your location, along with all your data, so that you can surf the internet, safe in the knowledge that no one knows who or where you are. So browse the web incognito by downloading Surfshark today via the link in the video description below and entering the special promo code, and receive 3 months free of charge, along with 85% off your subscription. The man known to history as Edward of Woodstock, or Edward the Black Prince, was born on the 15th of June, 1330, at Woodstock Palace, in the county of Oxfordshire, England. His mother was Philippa of Hainault, the daughter of William I, Count of Hainault, who was Queen of England from the 24th of January 1328 until her death on the 15th of August 1369. She married Edward III of England in 1328 after the king's mother, Isabella, had decided that an alliance with Flanders would be beneficial. For her attempt to remove her husband from the throne of England, Philippa's marriage to the king would produce 13 children, of whom Prince Edward was the eldest. Prince Edward's father, King Edward III of England, was the son of Edward II and Isabella of France, who was crowned as king at the age of 14, after his weak and unpopular father was deposed by his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble, who, with Isabella, organised an uprising whilst in France, and invaded England in 1326, rapidly supplanting Edward's government, which had lost the support of the nobles of England. The English lords felt no loyalty to the king, as they resented the influence of Edward II's unpopular favourites, first Piers Gaveston and then Hugh Despenser, both of whom exercised considerable influence over the government through their close relationships with Edward, which were resented by his wife Isabella. Furthermore, the English lords viewed the reign as a disaster, following the crushing defeat against Robert the Bruce of Scotland at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, which left the north of England vulnerable to raids by the Scottish king, as well as the devastating famines of 1314 to 1321, which Edward was seen as having a weak and insufficient response to. Therefore, assisted by a popular uprising against the king and Despenser in London on the 26th of October, Isabella and Mortimer announced their right to govern England on behalf of the 13-year-old Edward III, and Edward II and Despenser were captured in Wales whilst attempting to flee to Ireland, and whilst Edward was imprisoned in Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire, the hated Despenser was brutally hung, drawn, and quartered on the 24th of November. On the 24th of January 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate, and his son was crowned as Edward III of England on the 1st of February, but all effective power lay in the hands of Isabella and Mortimer. Needless to say, the 14-year-old king was shocked by the sudden destruction of his previously stable family and political life, and although not greatly attached to his father, the boy was still saddened by the news that he had been deposed by Isabella, which was swiftly followed by his death in September 1327. However, Edward would soon show that he was nothing like his father in terms of his political and military abilities. It was the birth of his son and heir Edward of Woodstock that galvanised the king to move against the increasingly unpopular Mortimer and Isabella, and on the 19th of October 1330, Edward III raided a castle where the couple were residing in Nottingham and captured them, and on the 29th of November, Mortimer was accused of murdering Edward II and executed, whilst Isabella was confined in a Norfolk castle and banned from all political activity. Edward's swift and decisive reassertion of royal power was welcomed by the English nobility and brought a sense of relief upon the entire country, who embraced their 18-year-old monarch as a king akin to his grandfather, Edward I, whose military prowess had united and strengthened England. And so the king resolved to wage war on the Scots, like his grandfather had done, to avenge the humiliation of Bannockburn, as well as their numerous raids in the north of England, and Edward III demonstrated that he did indeed take after his grandfather and not his father with regards to military talent, and his well-disciplined and well-trained army, utilising the longbow to great effect, secured a complete victory over the Scottish forces at the Battle of Halidon Hill on the 19th of July 1333, killing numerous Scottish lords and routing their army from the field. Edward was received as a hero on his return to England, with comparisons being made between the young warrior king and the legendary King Arthur, and with this resounding victory, Edward became determined to pursue the redemption of his kingdom from the disaster of his father's reign through military glory, and in this task, his son would become an able and willing participant. Details of the early life of Edward of Woodstock are scarce, though he was made the Earl of Chester in 1333, his first title, and was brought up in the surroundings of a magnificent court, where feasting and celebration were abundant. The young prince was dressed in fine silk clothes and given a personal tailor. However, the prince's father did not simply shower his son in luxury, rather he wanted to ensure that his heir embraced and mastered the world of chivalry, and to this end, the prince received his first suit of armour at the age of 7, and from the age of 13, participated in numerous chivalric tournaments held by the king, in which dueling and jousting between aristocratic knights featured prominently. The first decade of his reign saw Edward embroiled in conflict with the Scottish king David Bruce, son of the legendary Robert the Bruce, leading multiple campaigns in the Scottish borderlands following Halidon Hill. However, his thoughts soon began turning more towards England's greatest enemy, France, and in 1337, Edward would make a bold move to claim the French throne, launching what would become known as the 100 Years' War, the conflict in which the Black Prince would establish himself as one of the greatest military leaders of the medieval period. The origins of Edward's claim came from the death in 1328 of Charles IV of France without a male heir, leaving two chief claimants for the throne, Philip, Count of Valois, who was Edward's cousin and Charles's closest relative in the male line, and Edward himself, whose mother Isabella was Charles's sister, and in early 1329, the French aristocracy chose Philip of Valois to become Philip VI of France. This choice was not contested at first, primarily because in 1329, Isabella and Mortimer wanted to maintain good relations with the French, and when Edward took personal control of England, he too had cordial relations with Philip, but relations between the monarchs soured when Philip gave support to David Bruce of Scotland and deteriorated further when in 1337, Philip threatened to confiscate Gascony, England's only holding on the continent. Therefore, in February 1337, Edward III put forward his claim to the French throne to Parliament, and at this Parliament, he also outlined his intention to make the Black Prince guardian of the realm whenever the king was absent, although the boy was just 6 years old at the time. The king wanted the prince to learn from experience at this young age, so that he would be prepared for wielding more substantial authority in the future. Edward wanted to draw the French forces into battle, and so invaded northern France in autumn 1339, using scorched earth tactics to devastate the countryside. However, Philip refused to meet the king in battle and withdrew his forces into defensive positions. The English king therefore retired to Flanders without a victory, but in January 1340, in the city of Ghent, Edward formally declared himself King of France by raising his shield, upon which the coats of arms of England and France were now joined, the leopards of England in 2 quarters, alongside the French fleur-de-lis. By 1340, Edward was desperate for a victory over the French, as his heavy taxation of England was coming under increasing scrutiny, and so he assembled more than 100 ships at Holbrook in the east of England to ferry his troops to Flanders and begin a new offensive with his Flemish allies. However, the French had anticipated Edward and were blockading his entry to Flanders with a fleet twice as large as his own. Edward received news of this, but chose to sail nevertheless on the 22nd of June. The fleets clashed near the town of Sluys, and though the French boats were faster and more manoeuvrable, their sailors were inexperienced in combat, whilst Edward's vessels were crammed with archers and men-at-arms, hardened by fighting in Scotland. Furthermore, the French boats were bound together to maintain a defensive position, making the fleet extremely immobile, and on the 24th of June, the English won total victory, capturing almost the entire French fleet and inflicting thousands of casualties on the enemy. However, despite the stunning naval success at the Battle of Sluys, Edward could still not force King Philip into a decisive battle on French territory, and soon ran out of funds, and was forced to abandon his 1340 campaign. After peace talks with France in 1344 ended in failure, Edward made plans for a major military campaign in Normandy, which would commence in 1346, one in which the Black Prince would take part. The boy would be 16 when the campaign began, and having grown up surrounded by visions of chivalric glory through his father's tournaments and military campaigns, the prince was eager to join his father's quest for the crown of France. The king and his son, who was made the Prince of Wales in 1343, landed in Normandy on the 12th of July 1346 with a 14,000-strong army, intending to lay waste to the duchy's rich agricultural lands and bring Philip to battle. Upon arrival, the prince was knighted by his father and was given command of the vanguard of the army, the leading unit. After pillaging Caen in late July, with the Black Prince playing a leading role in the town's capture, Edward's army continued their easterly march through Normandy before turning south and advancing on Paris, and as criticism mounted towards the French king for his failure to defend his kingdom from the pillaging invaders, he sent a letter on the 14th of August to Edward challenging him to a battle. This was what the English king had been waiting for, and he immediately marched north to select a battlefield of his choosing, and after crossing the River Somme on the 24th of August, he arrived on a ridge of high ground between the villages of Crécy and Wadicourt, with woodland to the rear of his position. The king had around 2,500 men-at-arms, 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 spearmen, and 5,000 to 7,000 longbowmen at Crécy, whilst the approaching French force was much larger, with a strength of approximately 30,000 men. However, whilst the English were well rested on the 26th of August, having arrived at the battlefield a day before the French army was exhausted after their long march northwards, yet Philip's nobles were impatient to engage the enemy immediately, and the king was pressured into calling an immediate attack, giving the English troops an advantage over the tired and disorganised French. And whilst King Edward commanded the centre of the army and the Earl of Northampton the left, the Black Prince was given command of the right wing of the English force, which lay forward of the rest of the army, and so would bear the brunt of French attacks. The French advance was led by Genoese crossbowmen. However, they arrived on the battlefield without their shields, which were stuck further back in the baggage train, and they were met by massed volleys of Edward's longbowmen, which forced many to fall back in disarray. Meanwhile, the French cavalry had begun building up behind them, and seeing the Genoese falter, they charged through the crossbowmen, causing chaos and confusion in the French ranks as they charged towards the English line, and a division of knights led by the blind King John of Bohemia, who was tied to his horse, charged the English right under the Black Prince, forcing the archers to fall behind the men-at-arms and leading to a severe struggle in which the prince himself was beaten to the ground and his banner felled. However, reinforcements from the English left helped repel the French attack, and Prince Edward, though badly concussed, soon picked himself up and continued fighting valiantly. King Philip himself had 2 horses slain under him during the battle and received an arrow wound to his face, and as night fell, with his army disintegrating around him against a steady English advance, he reluctantly fled the field, conceding a terrible defeat to King Edward's triumphant army. The Battle of Crécy was one of the greatest English victories of the 100 Years' War, and with Edward's army sustaining fewer than 300 casualties, whilst the French casualties, though not known for certain, were likely around 14,000, including a great number of prominent nobles and princes, such as Philip's brother, the Count of Alençon, and King John of Bohemia. Indeed, The Black Prince and his father came across the body of John when surveying the battlefield the following day, and were deeply moved, for John was one of the foremost warriors of his age, losing his sight whilst on crusade, and perishing valiantly whilst charging the English line. And it is said that the prince therefore took John's emblem of the 3 white feathers and made it his own, and John's emblem remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. Following the battle, Edward laid siege to the port of Calais, whilst an invading Scottish army, encouraged by Philip to exploit Edward's absence, was decisively defeated at Neville's Cross by an English force under the Archbishop of York on the 17th of October, 1346. Calais finally surrendered in August 1347, and in October of that year, King Edward negotiated a truce and returned to London. Having attained his first taste of chivalric glory at Crecy, Prince Edward also attained independence, establishing a full household with knights and squires, priests, clerks, messengers, and keepers of the armoury, and took an active role in managing his estates. Indeed, the prince became renowned for his generosity to his intimates, giving gifts of great value and opulence to his family and his closest associates. However, the spirit of jubilation across England surrounding Edward and his son's great victories was soon brought to an end, when in August 1348, the Black Death crossed the English Channel and ravaged the country, killing between 40 and 60% of the population. Indeed, the Black Prince was personally impacted by the disease, as it claimed the life of his sister Joan on the 2nd of September. Nevertheless, in spite of the plague, on the 23rd of April, 1349, King Edward inaugurated his chivalric order at Windsor Castle, naming it the Order of the Garter. It had 26 members, including the Black Prince, who had assisted his father in selecting the other founding members, all of whom were selected based on acts of valour rather than simply their rank. Furthermore, the order was another step in Edward's quest to imbue his country with both a chivalric and pious spirit, as dedicated religious observance, as well as martial prowess, bound the knights of the order together, and the order would be arguably the most lasting legacy of Edward III's reign, as it remains the most senior order of knights in the United Kingdom today. As the effects of the plague began to dissipate in late 1349, King Edward saw the chance to return to the offensive against France, and after hearing of an imminent attempt to recapture Calais, the king and his son went to the vital port ahead of the French, and sprung a trap on their enemy, repulsing the French force on the 1st of January 1350, although not without the Black Prince having to lead his garrison in saving his father, after Edward became stranded outside the city gates against a much larger enemy force. The Black Prince owned large estates throughout the country, and although he implemented a host of cash-generating policies when his revenues fell after the Black Death, the prince showed himself to be a tough but fair landlord, instructing his revenue official in Cornwall in 1351 to deal equitably and rightly with his tenants, and to protect them from oppressions and extortions. Furthermore, after local unrest in the county of Cheshire in the summer of 1353, the prince travelled to the county himself, holding judicial sessions to settle grievances. He also agreed to grant Cheshire a Charter of Liberties, which he did on the 10th of September. Though showing himself to be a fair and equitable landlord, the Black Prince was also gaining a reputation as an overly indulgent spender, as well as his regular expensive gift-giving. The prince was constantly living beyond his financial means to fund his extravagant lifestyle, and by 1350 faced mounting debt. However, it should be noted that the prince's extravagance and generosity was not mindless spending, for in medieval England, a lord needed to be generous in feasting and gift-giving to recruit men into his service and maintain their allegiance, and thus striking the balance between rewarding his men and avoiding the burden of debt was a challenge faced by many medieval lords. In 1355, Jean de Grailly, a knight of the Garter from Gascony, an English-held province in southern France, informed King Edward that English supporters in the region were concerned with the actions of Jean, the Count of Armagnac, who had been appointed by King John II of France as governor of the southern region of Languedoc, and who had captured a number of Gascon towns and fortresses, and in 1354 was attempting to win Gascon nobles to the French cause. Edward was keen to resume the offensive against France, and on the 24th of May, his Great Council decided that the Black Prince should lead an expedition from Gascony to secure the province and punish the Count of Armagnac. Furthermore, on the 10th of July, the prince was made the king's lieutenant in Gascony, allowing him to act with the king's authority in the region, and was given an army of 2,600 men to be bolstered by Gascon soldiers. Accompanying the prince were 14 knights of the Garter, including the experienced Earls of Warwick and Suffolk, and the prince's special advisors and close friends, Sir John Chandos and Sir James Audley, and after setting sail from Plymouth on the 8th of September, the prince reached Bordeaux on the 20th of September, 1355. After taking counsel with his military advisors and Gascon nobles, a ceremony was held on the 21st of September in St. Andre Cathedral, where the prince took his oath as Lieutenant of Gascony, and following the ceremony, the prince spoke directly to the inhabitants of Bordeaux, telling them his hatred for the Count of Armagnac and his plan to take the offensive against the Languedoc governor by marching east and ravaging his lands in the Great Chevauchée, a French term meaning a brutal plundering raid, where land either side of the advancing column was burned. The aim of a chevauchée was to plunder and destroy the wealth and resources of an enemy lord's lands, in order to wreck his capacity to make war, humiliate him, and demonstrate to his vassals that he was incapable of protecting them, and this was carried out with fire, devastation, and slaughter. However, although this may sound brutal and shocking in the modern era, it was a common tactic in the medieval period, used by the Scots against northern England in 1327 and by King Edward in Normandy during the Crécy campaign. With the Gascon contingents joining his army, the Black Prince's force reached around 8,000 men, and on the 5th of October they set off from Bordeaux, following the River Garonne and entering Armagnac's land on the 12th of October, where the troops began burning, and fires soon raged for many miles around the army. Indeed, the Anglo-Gascon soldiers now wreaked havoc on Armagnac's estates, as villages and castles were plundered and razed to the ground, although out of piety, the prince ordered that all church property be spared. Though Armagnac was in command of a force much larger than the Anglo-Gascons, the quality of his soldiers was low, and he did not want to risk battle against the Black Prince's experienced men. Thus he gathered his army in the fortified city of Toulouse and destroyed the bridges over the Garonne and Ariège rivers, which turned south and stood in the way of the prince's march, and then Armagnac waited, hoping the raid would fizzle out or come to a halt before the rivers. On the 28th of October, the prince reached the Garonne, 8 miles south of Toulouse, and although many in his army quivered in fear before the fast-moving river, the prince had been informed by local guides in his service that the stream could be forded, and so he led his army across the Garonne and Ariège in a single day, and this audacious move greatly boosted the morale of the Anglo-Gascon army, whilst causing panic and shock amongst Armagnac and the French, who assumed the prince would turn back before the rivers. Instead, his army now moved east through the county of Languedoc, a region totally unprepared for the carnage that bore down upon them. As the Anglo-Gascons pillaged the poorly defended villages and towns of Languedoc, the army reached the major town of Carcassonne and razed its outer settlements to the ground on the 6th of November, and then continued on to the Narbonne, which was occupied on the 8th of November, and the prince's troops had, by now, covered 250 miles since leaving Bordeaux and were within sight of the Mediterranean Sea. After holding a council of war, the prince decided to return to Gascony before the winter weather set in, and so on the 10th of November, the Anglo-Gascons turned and marched west, continuing to burn and plunder as they went, even as the prince visited and prayed at numerous abbeys and religious houses on the return journey. The prince's army recrossed the Garonne on the 20th of November, and after receiving reinforcements, the Count of Armagnac finally left Toulouse, but despite his superior numbers, the Count still wanted to avoid a set-piece battle with the enemy, so he simply shadowed the Anglo-Gascons as they marched west, much to the fury of John II, the French king. On the 28th of November, the prince arrived back on Gascon soil and spent Christmas at Bordeaux, amid great rejoicing and celebration, for the expedition had been a clear success, as in the 8-week raid, the prince's army had destroyed more than 500 villages, towns, and castles, crippling a region that was an important economic base for the French king's war effort, as royal tax revenue from Languedoc was a substantial component of the king's military budget prior to the Great Raid. Furthermore, many Gascon lords who had joined the French now rallied to the English cause, as Armagnac's failure to protect his vassals' lands had been brutally exposed. The chevauchée also demonstrated the Black Prince's skill as a military commander, as he had stunned the French with the force and speed of his raid, particularly in the crossing of the Garonne and Ariège, and had honed his Anglo-Gascon army into a disciplined, resilient, and formidable fighting force. However, the raid had also alienated him from the Count of Armagnac, and their mutual enmity would eventually come back to haunt the prince. Viewing the unstable political situation in France in 1356, Edward III sensed an opportunity to launch a wider offensive against his enemy, as King John II was facing a crisis in his relations with the nobility, originating from John's arrest of the powerful aristocrat Charles of Navarre and other Norman lords at a dinner party in Rouen, when he threw Charles in jail and executed 4 nobles, causing Normandy to rise in revolt against the French king. To exploit this situation, whilst his son conquered territory around the borders of Gascony, King Edward sent a small force under the Duke of Lancaster to Normandy at the beginning of June 1356 and urged the Black Prince to march north to link up with Lancaster's army in order to attack John II's son, the Count of Poitiers, who was charged with the defence of France, south of the Loire River. The prince was delayed in his expedition by the resurgent Count of Armagnac, whose incursions into Gascony forced the prince to leave 2,000 of his 8,000-strong force in the duchy to defend it, before he began his march on the 4th of August, moving north through France and devastating the lands as they went, whilst avoiding well-fortified castles and towns. However, as the prince neared the Loire River, he began to realise the serious danger his army was in, as Lancaster had ended his Normandy campaign in the face of a larger French force, whilst John II was building an immense army at Chartres. As although John remained unpopular with French aristocracy, they now rallied to him, out of fear of the Black Prince and his dreaded Anglo-Gascon army, and thus the king was able to assemble a force more than twice the size of the prince's, who now became desperate to locate and link up with Lancaster's army, especially after a skirmish between his vanguard and a French reconnaissance force on the 31st of August confirmed that the French were nearby. On the 7th of September, the prince's army reached the Loire in the suburbs of Tours, aiming to join Lancaster, who was just 70 miles away on the north bank. However, heavy rain soon made the swollen river impassable, and after receiving news that John's army was advancing towards him just 20 miles away, the Black Prince ordered a retreat, whilst Lancaster withdrew into Brittany, leaving the Black Prince to fend for himself. With both armies moving south, the French had managed to overtake and cut across the English line of march, and were now west of their enemy, near Poitiers, gathering reinforcements, and after the Anglo-Gascons' brief engagement with the French rear guard, it was clear that a major confrontation was imminent. However, whilst the prince led about 7,000 men, King John had between 20 and 30,000 men in his army. On the 18th of September, the prince took up his position southeast of Poitiers and deployed his army, as he had at Crécy, in a strong natural position, occupying a ridge of high ground, his flanks protected by thick woods on one side and a steep escarpment on the other, with wagons from the baggage train used to shield his flanks further. In addition, his forces were placed behind a line of thick hedges, and the ground in front of the English line was littered with natural obstacles such as vines and marshes. The prince placed Warwick and Oxford's division on his left, Suffolk and Salisbury's on his right, whilst he commanded the centre. His longbowmen were placed on the wings of the army. On the morning of the 19th of September, John had arrived before the English army, and both sides readied themselves for battle, with John ordering most of his men to dismount due to the difficulties of a mass cavalry attack on the broken terrain, and forming his army into 3 divisions, led by the Dauphin Charles, John's brother Philip, the Duke of Orleans, and himself. At 7:30 AM, the prince gathered his carts and moved them in a southern direction, as if he were retreating, in order to ensure that the French attacked, for his army were low on provisions, and thus he needed an immediate battle. The feint worked, and the French heavy cavalry, desperate to prevent the English escaping, charged the English line. Indeed, this charge met with initial success, as the armoured French horses resisted the prince's archers and crashed into the Anglo-Gascons. However, only the horses in the front line were armoured, and after repositioning to the side, the English archers targeted the horses behind the front line to devastating effect, destroying the momentum of the French assault, and the cavalry that had broken through the defences was surrounded and cut down. Then, behind the cavalry, the Dauphin's infantry advanced upon the English and were battered by a hail of arrows as they marched. The English attacked the exhausted French men-at-arms and spilled around the flanks of the French line, forcing them to retreat after 2 hours of bloody fighting. The Dauphin's retreating men then collided with the advance of the Duke of Orleans, sending his men back in confusion. However, the strongest French division under King John, viewing the mass retreat in front of them, now began to advance. Nevertheless, the Black Prince and his advisors had a cunning plan to launch a surprise cavalry charge directly at the French line, while secretly sending another mounted force on a large-scale flanking maneuver to fall on the French left, causing widespread panic and confusion in John's ranks. The English archers, meanwhile, having expended their arrows, threw down their bows and launched themselves into battle. With the French army now broken up and with many soldiers fleeing, the French king was surrounded and, after a brave last stand, was captured by the English. On the evening of the 19th of September, French dead stood at 2,500 men-at-arms and a larger number of other ranks, and dozens of notable lords were captured, whilst English casualties are unknown, and no Anglo-Gascon noblemen were killed. Indeed, it was clear that from the jaws of defeat, the Black Prince had snatched an improbable and total victory, one of the greatest victories in English history. The captured King John was treated with the utmost courtesy and respect by the Black Prince, who waited on his table on the evening after the battle and praised the king's valour and bravery, even refusing to sit with John while he ate, because he did not deem himself worthy of such an honour. Indeed, if the central tenets of medieval chivalry were bravery in battle and the showing of respect to one's enemy, then at Poitiers, the Black Prince had demonstrated why he would be remembered in history as the embodiment of a chivalrous warrior. The Anglo-Gascon army returned to Bordeaux on the 5th of October to great public jubilation, having met no resistance from the stunned French and having signed a 2-year truce with John on the 23rd of March, 1357. The prince and his royal captives set sail for England, arriving on the 3rd of May, and on the 24th of that month, Edward of Woodstock rode through London in triumph, parading his captive for the joyous crowds at the undoubted summit of his career as England's warrior prince. On the 8th of May, 1358, Edward III signed an agreement with John II, in which John agreed to pay 4 million French crowns for his release and recognised Edward as sovereign ruler of the large southern province of Aquitaine, and in return, Edward would renounce his claim to the French throne. This was a treaty which was a substantial victory for the English. Following his victory, the prince fell back into his ever-persistent problem of overspending and debt, as he began extensive rebuilding projects across his residences and embarked on an ambitious expansion of the Val Royal in Cheshire, an abbey begun by his great-grandfather Edward I, and this, combined with his generous rewarding of his followers after the Poitiers campaign, meant that by the summer of 1358, the prince's finances were in serious crisis. Nevertheless, when the French provisional government rejected the treaty signed with John, the Black Prince and his father once again led a large expedition into France on the 28th of October, 1359, intending to march on Reims and have Edward III crowned as King of France. However, the army failed to capture Reims due to stern resistance from the city, and after a severe storm ravaged the troops in mid-April 1360 near Paris, Edward decided to negotiate, agreeing to the Treaty of Brittany on the 8th of May 1360 with the Dauphin Charles, which ceded to Edward Aquitaine as well as some lands in the north, totaling around a third of the territory of modern France, whilst Edward relinquished his claim to the French throne and lowered John's ransom to 3 million crowns. During the following summer of 1361, the 31-year-old Black Prince chose to marry Joan of Kent, his 33-year-old twice-married cousin, and though his father had wanted his son to marry a younger, foreign bride to secure a continental alliance, by all accounts, the prince was infatuated with Joan and married her for love rather than political gain. Edward of Woodstock would soon return to France, however, as on the 19th of July, 1362, he was invested as Prince of Aquitaine, England's newly won French province, in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey, as a reward for his victory at Poitiers, and after extensive preparations, the prince departed from England the following summer, bringing with him most of his household, as well as over 600 soldiers, arriving at Lormont near Bordeaux on the 29th of June. Upon arrival, the prince held a series of ceremonies as he toured across Aquitaine, and throughout the summer he received homage from the province's various lords as they swore fealty to their new English overlord, often reluctantly. Nevertheless, the prince was quite popular at the beginning of his rule, as his exceedingly generous hospitality and grand feasts endeared him to local knights and lords, and his magnificent court was an uplifting sight for a war-weary region. Furthermore, the prince and his wife were extremely happy in their new domain, especially upon the birth of their first child in January 1365, a son whom they called Edward. In addition, in a meeting of the three estates, the representative body of Aquitaine, in September 1365, the prince showed himself to be willing to listen to the grievances of his subjects and act to address them, working to reduce lawlessness in his lands after hearing complaints of marauding brigands and feuding lords. Meanwhile, France had a new king, following the death of John II in March 1364, as the weak and sickly Dauphin Charles became Charles V of France. But despite his physical frailty, Charles would prove himself to be a strong and effective ruler and a formidable adversary for the Black Prince, who by 1365 was already experiencing some tension with his nobles, including his old enemy the Count of Armagnac, who had not yet performed homage to the prince, and Charles V would work to exacerbate these tensions. However, the Black Prince's attention was soon drawn away from Aquitaine and towards Spain when he received a message in 1366 from the displaced King of Castile, Pedro, begging the prince to help restore him to the throne. The 32-year-old Pedro had succeeded his father Alfonso XI as the sole child of a loveless marriage to Queen Maria of Portugal, but his father preferred his mistress, Leonor de Guzman, with whom he had multiple children, who he showered with honor and affection, whilst isolating Pedro, who forged a strong resentment towards his half-siblings, especially the eldest, Enrique of Trastamara. As king, Pedro was a valuable ally of Edward III after their agreement in 1362, as Castile was the largest and most powerful state in the Iberian Peninsula. However, in 1366, Pedro was removed from the throne by his bitter enemy Enrique in an invasion supported by Charles V of France, causing him to flee to Gascony in July of that year. Many of the prince's advisors, and initially the prince himself, were opposed to helping Pedro, as in his rapid evacuation, he had brought no soldiers with him, meaning that the prince would have to mobilize an army and bear the financial burden of the campaign, and more importantly, Pedro would become known by posterity as the Cruel for his numerous acts of violence as king, and was widely considered an unstable tyrant, and was also excommunicated from the Catholic Church. But the prince, who followed a strict code of morality and piety, was intensely loyal to the church, and so was personally repelled by the Castilian monarch. Nevertheless, Edward III, weary of allowing Castile to come under French influence, was determined to uphold the Anglo-Castilian alliance, and the prince, whose loyalty to his father overrode his disapproval of Pedro, thus reluctantly signed a treaty to help restore the Castilian king on September 23rd, 1366, on the condition that Pedro swear an oath to amend his life and government upon returning to the throne and repair his relations with the church. After the birth, on the 6th of January 1367, of his second son Richard, who would later become King Richard II of England, the prince left Bordeaux to join his assembling army, over 6,000 strong, in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains, and on the 14th of February the prince's vanguard under Sir John Chandos crossed the Pyrenees, followed on the 20th by the prince with the main body reaching Pamplona, the capital of Navarre, on the 23rd of February. As the prince's army reached Vitoria, it suffered under harsh weather and a lack of provisions, and while encamped around Vitoria, it was ambushed on the 25th of March by the Franco-Spanish force under Enrique, losing hundreds of men. However, this shock kicked the prince into action, and after retreating to Navarre, he marched south on a new route, whilst exchanging letters with Enrique, as the two commanders goaded each other into battle. On the 3rd of April, the two armies would meet on an open plain a mile east of the town of Najera, and though the exact sizes of the armies are disputed, it is likely that Enrique of Trastamara held the numerical advantage, but the Black Prince used the advantage of the element of surprise by shielding his advance behind a ridge and appearing unexpectedly with his army on Enrique's left flank. The surprised Franco-Spanish launched a poorly coordinated cavalry charge, which was shot down by Anglo-Gascon archers. Indeed, Enrique's Spanish soldiers were not accustomed to the devastating effectiveness of the English longbow, which broke the advancing infantry in similar fashion, and the prince, seeing the enemy's distress, charged his mounted soldiers to rout the Spanish and French troops. The Battle of Najera was another complete victory for the Black Prince, whose army inflicted heavy casualties on the Spanish, while sustaining very few casualties themselves, much to the delight of Edward III, who had English propaganda glorify the prince's achievement. Despite this, the Black Prince was soon frustrated to learn that Enrique had escaped to France, to be shielded by Charles V. On the 2nd of May at Burgos, Pedro was presented with the cost of the campaign, and the sum he owed to the prince was over £400,000, and although he intended to remain with his army in Spain to ensure the debt was paid off, an outbreak of dysentery hit the army in August when the prince himself was struck with the sickness, and so the Anglo-Gascons marched back across the Pyrenees and returned to Bordeaux in early September 1367. By autumn of 1367, Pedro's failure to repay his debts left the Black Prince on the verge of bankruptcy, with most of his army still unpaid, and so the prince was forced to resort to taxing Aquitaine, introducing a property tax known as the fouage, which was approved by the estates in January 1368. However, a minority of noblemen, led by the Count of Armagnac and the Lord of Albret, themselves facing serious debt, denounced the tax as oppressive and refused to allow its collection on their lands. Following his Spanish expedition, many of the prince's political strengths were fading, as he now lacked the financial means to maintain loyalty through his generosity and gift-giving, and his personal charm was greatly diminished by debilitating sickness, which continually plagued him from the summer of 1368, and in June of that year, Charles saw his opportunity and took it, entering an agreement with Armagnac, Albret, and the Count of Périgord, 3 influential Aquitaine nobles who were resentful of the prince and his new tax, pledging to defend them if the prince ever attacked their domains, and granted them lands and funds, whilst the nobles promised to fight for Charles to recover Aquitaine for the French crown. As the prince's health worsened, his hold over Aquitaine became ever more precarious. Edward III, whose energy and decisiveness had declined with age and ill health, failed to provide the prince with adequate financial resources, and had dithered, whilst Louis, Duke of Anjou, brother of Charles V, began raising troops in southern France, in coordination with the rebellious nobles, to threaten the prince's authority. Furthermore, the prince's position was further weakened when Enrique of Trastamara reconquered Castile and killed Pedro in March of 1369, placing a French ally directly south of the prince's lands. In June 1369, following months of tension, war broke out once again between England and France, and Edward III sent a small force under the Earl of Cambridge and Pembroke to assist the Black Prince. Charles, meanwhile, had saved prudently through his reign, and had large funds with which to supply the rebellious lords, as towns and castles in vulnerable eastern Aquitaine began to fall to the French. As he remained crippled by illness, to add to the prince's woes, he began to lose some of his closest military companions. Sir James Audley died of sickness at the end of August, whilst his most experienced captain in Aquitaine, Sir John Chandos, was killed in a skirmish in Poitou on the 1st of January. The French then launched an offensive in the summer of 1370 with 2 large armies, one of which, under Charles V's brother John, Duke of Berry, captured the city of Limoges in northeastern Aquitaine in mid-August, after the Bishop Jean de Croix, a trusted friend of the Black Prince, surrendered it to the French. However, the majority of the townspeople remained loyal to the English. The prince, aghast at the city's surrender, joined a 4,000-strong army and marched to Limoges in what would be his final expedition, though he had to be carried in a litter as he was by now too ill to mount a horse. Nevertheless, the army arrived and laid siege to the city on the 14th of September, and on the 19th, the prince's miners succeeded in destroying a large section of the city wall, allowing the English troops to surge into Limoges and push back the French defenders. The city was pillaged and burnt by the retreating French and advancing English, and when the Bishop of Limoges was brought before the prince, he was told that he deserved execution. Although he was ultimately spared, the recovery of Limoges was an important victory for the English. However, on the 29th of September, the prince learned of the death of his eldest son, Edward, of the plague, and this devastating news, combined with his declining ability to provide effective leadership due to illness, made him resolve to leave Aquitaine and return to England. The capture of Limoges would, however, become mired in infamy, as the French chronicler Jean Froissart, who was not present at the siege, wrote an account of the capture, depicting an angry prince unleashing his vengeance upon the city, ordering his soldiers to kill civilians indiscriminately. Despite this, there is much contemporary evidence to suggest that Froissart's account was largely fabricated, as although there was substantial property damage, civilian and military casualties combined were by almost all accounts around 300, rather than Froissart's 3,000, and it is therefore likely that Froissart's depiction of the prince's cruel vengeance was propaganda, aimed at staining his reputation, rather than an accurate account of the event. Nevertheless, this story of the capture of Limoges would act as a stain on the prince's reputation, even to this day. In early January 1371, the prince and his household sailed to England, where the remainder of his life would be spent, residing mostly in Berkhamsted Castle, having left his brother John of Gaunt in charge of the worsening military situation in Aquitaine. As he was haunted by dysentery in his last years in England, the prince became even more devoted to religion and to the church, becoming close friends with Thomas de la Mare, the abbot of St. Albans, who helped the prince form a strict regime of penitence and prayer, as the prince suspected that his sickness was divine judgment for his helping of Pedro of Castile, an excommunicant, and so he sought God's forgiveness. The summer of 1372 saw further military gains for the French in Aquitaine, as Charles's men seized Poitiers on the 7th of August. Indeed, by the time a year's truce was signed in June 1375, England's holdings on the continent had been greatly diminished. At home, Edward III had lost much of his immense popularity, as he came increasingly under the influence of his young mistress, Alice Perez. The Black Prince, meanwhile, remained a figure of great admiration for the people of England. As the prince approached his 46th year in 1376, he was virtually unable to leave his bed, and on the 1st of June, he was carried to the Palace of Westminster so that he could spend the last of his days with his father, who the prince had served with the utmost devotion throughout his life, even though their relationship had been somewhat strained since the Spanish campaign. On Sunday, the 8th of June, 1376, Edward of Woodstock said a final prayer and died, to the despair of the people of England, who, it was said by contemporary chroniclers, always felt safe from invasion whilst the prince was alive. He was a man admired even by his enemies. Indeed, Charles V and his court, on hearing of the prince's death, held a mass in Paris to honour him, and he was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, where his tomb can still be seen today. The origins of the name, the Black Prince, are not known for certain, though Prince Edward was not called by this name whilst he was alive. Rather, it was adopted during the Tudor era, over 150 years after his death. Some speculate that his name arises from the black armour he is said to have worn into battle, while some claim that it arises from his dark reputation in France, where his 1355 chevauchée and stories of his sacking of Limoges earned him the title Black, whilst others argue that it originates from his coat of arms, which depicted 3 ostrich feathers on a black background. Whatever the origins of his name, the Black Prince is regarded as one of the greatest medieval warriors in the history of England, playing a leading role in 2 of the most decisive and iconic English victories in the 100 Years' War, namely Crécy and Poitiers, and winning another total victory in Spain at Nájera. He was admired and respected by the people of England throughout his life, and by his friends and soldiers, whom he never ceased to reward generously for their service to him, and even by the French kings John II and Charles V, who recognised the prince's valour and honour. The prince's reputation has significant blemishes, however, especially in France, where his brutal raids through Languedoc and northern Aquitaine prior to the Battle of Poitiers, including mass atrocities towards civilians and the destruction of significant swathes of French countryside. Furthermore, his persistent overspending meant he was almost always in severe debt, which could hinder his ability to rule effectively, and as Prince of Aquitaine, he failed to maintain English possession of Aquitaine, although due in large part to the failures of Edward III to adequately support him. However, it still leaves a stain on his career. Nevertheless, the Black Prince was above all else a hero for his time, labelled by his surgeon John Ardern, who accompanied him on many campaigns, as the very flower of chivalry, for there are few men in history who embodied medieval chivalry, as did Edward of Woodstock, the principles of courage in battle, showing honour towards one's opponents, and a dedication to God and to his sovereign, defined the warrior prince's life, who lived and died adhering to a code of chivalry that was widely aspired to by knights and nobles in medieval Europe. Indeed, chivalry in many ways defined the era of the Black Prince, and the Black Prince, in many ways, defined chivalry. What do you think of the Black Prince? Was he a ruthless warrior and tyrant, winning at any cost? Or was he pious, brave, and honourable, and in every way the greatest king that England never had? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.